Okay, so Biblical versus Secular History Part 2. Okay, the four topics that I want to cover. I mean, first of all, I'm going to recap. Secondly, I will cover Iran-Kurdistan prophecy. Thirdly, archaeology, which is the main part of this project. And then the note on the book of Esther at the end of the video. Depending upon how much time I have left, I will try to say something about it. So what I did in my latest video, I was trying to compare and compete biblical history with and against secular history. And then with the addition of the 7 minute in a week, I didn't cover it, I just mentioned it, but I said like for instance that secular history it contradicts itself and it is inconsistent with itself and it's also inconsistent with biblical history, which actually proves to be true because secular history confirms it. Sounds crazy, perhaps, but you'll be able to comprehend it all. Also, the part where I explained how the Big Bang is in the Bible. That was, by the way, the first argument that I used for with cosmology. Secondly, second one was how the map of the universe is literally in a single Bible verse. And with the map of the universe, I mean the cosmic microwave background, the CMB. Um, Now I'm going to cover the Iran-Kurdistan prophecy part. So what is this about? Well, like yesterday, revelation struck me, from God, that this whole situation with Iran, it is important to consider what the Bible has to say about it, since this might be the first step in the development of a new country, or actually the rebirth of a country. What am I talking about? Well, this is the first thing. Genesis 10. I have a project, called Prophecy and Genealogy. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but it is like you have these projects of Christians, who try to map out the patriarchs in Genesis 10 and apply them to nations or regions. I did the same thing, but improved it because those from these other Christians are based upon old projects and old information and there are imperfections. So one of the things I did was explain how Elam is the patriarch of the Kurds and that Madai is a patriarch of the Azeris. That the Medes are the Azeris and the Elamites are the Kurds. And so I'm going to say this, well, you have Jeremiah chapter 49, and you have also other chapters where an Elam occurs, but this is the most important chapter because this is where the prophecy is in. And Jeremiah 49 is in the chapter God curses a group of nations, also in chapter 48, and also Damascus, and like with things such as captivity. And Elam is also cursed with captivity. They will be dispersed into four corners, out of their land. They will lose their land and they will be in diaspora. But then he says at the end of the chapter, verse 39, if I'm right, but in the latter days I will restore the captives of Elam. The Hebrew word captive is sometimes translated to fortunes, but that's a mistranslation. Or at least in this chapter, in this verse, is a mistranslation. So the history of the Elamites, right? It's like they were an ancient people, and at some point they just disappeared, and consequently, historians dispute on who might be the descendants of the ancient Elamites, and so you have got this, and then you also got the history of the Coots, like where did the Coots come from? It's also a question. And my point is, if you mirror the history of the Coots with the history of the Elamites, the Elamites lost their nation, and the Coots, which were documented quite some time after the Elamites, have no history of having had a nation whatsoever. So once again, if you mirror these two against one another, you get this same picture, that the Elamites are the Kurds. And so, with this war situation in Iran once again, this might be the first step in the establishment of Kurdistan, of the nation of Elam to be reestablished. Anyway, whatever happens will happen. One way or another, Elam will be restored. So Kurdistan will become a nation. Something that, your friend may laugh at if you say it to them, depending upon from which culture they are. Once again, I'm not saying anything racist or whatever. So now the main part, archaeology. So you see, I wrote here Joshua and the Jericho myth. What do I mean with the Jericho myth? Well, there's this myth, Joshua is the most disputed, most controversial book in the Bible, and second after comes Esther, I'm sure. So, the main part of this controversy in the book of Joshua, at least to my understanding, is the archaeological part, because they say, well, Jericho, it is a fact that it was destroyed, blah blah, but it was 150 to 300 years earlier, so before the Israelites came to the land. And so, consequently, historians, secular historians, they say, well, it is a question whether Joseph even existed, The book of Joseph could have been written hundreds of years later, for instance, they say. But this is where the myth comes from. This team who had to do the archaeology, the leader of the team, she made an error with the archaeology because she looked at something she could not find, which was a vase, a pot, I mean, which at that time should have been present in Jericho because of its trademark. And not only is the problem that a replica has been found, proving that, the thing is, you have these historical layers, they could see when it was destroyed, the city of Jericho, but replica pots have been found, proving that it was actually present at that time, that it got destroyed. Not only that, but something else, something I'm forgetting now, but basically, it is a myth, that it wasn't a historical event that when the Israelites came to Jericho, that at that time it would have been destroyed. And it's like also the one who wrote Joshua got to the very detail, wrote how Jericho was destroyed, what it looked like, and how could they have known this, It's another question to think about. There's also another thing about Joshua, The altar of Joshua on Mount Ebal has been found. And the funny story is when this historian managed to find it, he came to this non religious Jewish architect, and he discussed the evidence with him, showed him the site, and said, "What do you think of it?" And then he said to him, No, I admit it could be the altar of Joshua, but it could also have been a watchtower. And by the way, if you see it, it's literally on video. It looks nothing like a watchtower. It's utterly impossible that it is a watchtower. But of course, if you're a secular historian, you can say anything you want as long as it does not literally disprove what you are saying. So you can even use a theory, state a theory as if it is a fact. And that's, by the way, what happens with stuff like the Big Bang, People misinterpret their stuff, or when they read articles from, scholars who do not misinterpret their own stuff, they forget that it is a theory and they spread it as if it is a fact. And that's how the Big Bang, why people think it is proven, while in reality only the rapid expansion is proven. The Bible actually says that God created this rapid expansion. And in my last video, I showed where, in part one. So, two other things. Bab-edh-Dhra, that's the site of Sodom. There's this video of this guy who literally goes to there, and then he does not go to the city that's been destroyed, but to a valley nearby that was once underwater. Why? Because sulfur balls, when they, it was destroyed with sulfur from heaven, city of Sodom. If it collides with a solid object, it burns off. But if it goes in the water, it is preserved. So he went to this valley and he was actually able to recover these balls. And he showed that those were actually sulfur balls by lighting them on fire. And they were literally in those walls of the valley. And you could see from the color, that they were very ancient sulfur balls. If I'm right, in the Israeli museum, there are giant spearheads present there. And secular historians say that they must have been decorative. Why decorative? Because they are so massive that it is absolutely impossible for a person to carry them all the way around. But to us Christians, we see that there's actually evidence that giants, the biblical giants, must have actually existed because they were the only ones who could have carried these massive spearheads all the way around. Okay, so I have a little more time. What can I say about the Book of Esther? Since it is so disputed, I made a video on my channel. You could probably spot it. I forgot what it is titled, but I'm sure I said, yeah, it was like how God humbles his enemies. I'm not sure if that was the title. You could watch my video if you want, because therein I give a biblical foreshadowing from the Book of Esther that's been fulfilled. Anyways, that was the end. This is the end of this video. God bless you.